Oh, there wasn't a Jim's move hands.
Yeah. Is that okay? Yeah. Again, let's yeah, I do.
Yes, I did. Come back with an agreement in our something for the minister. Yes, I looked it up on the definitely 3 after 6. They've got rid of all the argument. Friday. They've got to stay the entire day.
They can't do better than
But they can't say morning. Guess when the guys turn up, they just say, where are we going? No, I've had one before in my seat.
sleeping. It's the first night.
While they're there, I'm going to get them. They're downstairs. Garage. Sound like
Now they're doing things with other people's insurance.
slaves. Because they're so heavy, but they're an awkward shape. So yeah, maybe they'll say, no, sorry, mate.
Okay, that's
Yeah, no. We're not covered with it. Yes, no, I sat in one chair. Went back and thank you very much.
All right. Good evening and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out in the rain to our Politics in the Pub event tonight. My name is Alice Grundy. I'm Anne Cantor Fellow Research Manager at the Australia Institute. You may have noticed I'm not Ebony Bennett. She's unwell, so I'm stepping in for her tonight. I'm very grateful to be hosting this event on the unceded land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to any First Nations people here in the room. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. As many of you know, in 2024, the Australia Institute is celebrating its 30th anniversary as Australia's leading think tank. That's 30 years of big ideas. So as we come to the end of the financial year, why not chip in? All donations are tax deductible. You can find a QR code down the back, or you can visit our website. So this year, across the Pacific, the United States faces what will likely be its most important presidential election in generations. I'd like to welcome our special guests this evening to discuss that with you. We have two brilliant speakers, one of whom is on stage with me currently, and one had to deliver a speech at 6:20, and she will be joining us just as soon as is humanly possible. So I'll be asking the questions initially, and then I'll flag my final question so that you can start thinking about what you'd like to ask our speakers. And we have a microphone here, so you'll be able to be heard. To introduce our first speaker in absentia, Zoe Daniel MP is the independent member for Goldstein. At the 2022 election, she became the first woman elected to her federal seat. And Zoe spent almost 3 decades on the front line of news and current events in Australia and internationally as a 3-time foreign correspondent and former ABC News United States bureau chief. She is the author of 3 books, including Storyteller, which is an insight into her life as a foreign correspondent, and Greetings from Trumpland, an account of fragmenting trust in democracy in the United States. And I have next to me Dr. Emma Shortis, who is Senior Researcher in International and Security Affairs at the Australia Institute. Emma is a historian and writer focused on the history and politics of the United States and its role in the world. Her book, Our Exceptional Friend, is subtitled Australia's Fatal Alliance with the United States. You may have read her regular contributions to the conversation, and you've probably heard her on ABC Radio, most recently with Philip Adams. Welcome, Emma. So you've just come back from the United States in a whirlwind visit. Can you tell us about what you saw, heard, and experienced there?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Alice. So it was about as wild, I think, as you would expect. What you see on TV is real. I was in DC last week, there in part to support the campaign to free Australian citizen Julian Assange, which I know is a cause that's really important to Zoe as well, so I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more. But because I was there with the campaign, and Gabriel Shipton, Julian's brother, was a keynote speaker at the Libertarian National Convention, I was able to kind of sneak in to that, where Donald Trump also happened to be a keynote speaker. So I went to my first ever Trump rally while I was there in DC, which was, yeah, quite the experience, and I think a little bit unusual in, I guess, the kind of scale of Trump rallies, because the Libertarians actually don't like him very much. You know, you might expect them to kind of be on his side because he says all the right things about, you know, deconstructing the administrative state, and is very much into those kind of deep state conspiracies, but they're a really skeptical bunch, and they don't believe him when he says, you know, he's going to dismantle the deep state, or the administrative state as they call it, because he didn't do it during the first Trump administration. So they're really skeptical of Trump, and even kind of before he arrived had worked themselves up into quite a state about his first presidency and the promises he was making about the second. So, you know, you have to get to these Trump rallies so early, hours and hours and hours before he's on stage. And what happened at the Libertarian Convention is that all these Trump supporters had shown up early and sat in reserved seats that were reserved for Libertarian Party delegates, which of course really deeply upset them. And it almost came to blows a couple of hours even before Trump showed up. I'd gotten a really great seat right up the front, and I was thinking, this is excellent, like I'm going to be able to see him, I've got a direct line of sight to Trump. But a couple of hours before he showed up, I chickened out and moved up the back because the atmosphere was so hostile. And then, of course, he came out and started kind of running his usual lines, reading off the auto cue, but was booed almost immediately by libertarians who were heckling him about all kinds of things, about his COVID policies, about his, his lies, his failed promises, about his refusal to commit to pardoning Julian Assange, and Trump got angrier and angrier as this was happening because he's not used to that kind of crowd. He's used to people adoring him and only having adoring crowds. And what happened then was he was being booed, and there were kind of counter chants from the Trump supporters. So it was completely wild. But I learned so much, I think, by just being there. Like particularly in DC, the vibe does matter. But it wasn't heartening, I have to say.
And Trump wasn't the only Republican that you saw while you were there. Can you tell us about who else you saw and what they were like?
Yeah, sure. So I did see quite a few of them. My experience was a little bit skewed, I think, being at the Libertarian Convention, but I saw Vivek Ramaswamy, who was a kind of one-time contender for the Republican nomination and is really... I've never seen a thirstier campaign for the vice presidency. He was also at the Libertarian Convention kind of making his pitch to the Libertarians to support him for the vice presidency, kind of saying I'm going to bring the Libertarian cause into the White House if Trump wins. Again, they were super sceptical, and I'd be really surprised, I think, if Trump picks him because he's kind of too thirsty, he's too desperate for attention. So that was really quite fun to see him speak. But I also saw J.D. Vance, the senator from Ohio, who rose to prominence for writing a book called Hillbilly Elegy and has done that very now familiar, I think, Republican shift from being kind of Trump skeptic to being all in with Trump. And he's also kind of campaigning for the vice presidency. He spoke at a foreign policy conference that I went to, so he was focused very much on Ukraine, for example, and he's one of those Republicans who's very sceptical of funding to Ukraine and makes a very strong and quite coherent argument against American support for what they would describe as foreign wars, while simultaneously advocating for complete support for Israel based on Christian values, as he put them, and American middle class values. And so there's a real kind of tension going on, I think, on the right of American politics between the kind of Vivek Ramaswamy wing, I suppose, and the J.D. Vance much more conservative wing. And I think watching to see who wins that fight will give us a really clear indication of what a second Trump administration, of course, hypothetically, might look like.
It's interesting that you talk about a division within the Republican Party. I think a lot of what we see here in the reporting is about the polarization between Republicans and Democrats. Can you talk a little bit about your perceptions of polarization in the States?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for asking me this, because it's one of the things that drives me nuts about our coverage of the United States, because you see it all the time in all kinds of coverage of the US. It's about, the deepening polarization and how do they overcome this, extreme polarization. And I just have such a problem with framing American politics that way for a number of reasons. The first one being that it kind of assumes that there's this mythical centre pole where in some long ago golden era, there was consensus and everybody could be sensible and agree on something, which, if you know anything about American history, is not even remotely close to the truth. So, and at the same time, it implies this kind of equal drift to the extreme that, again, just doesn't align with the reality of American politics, where what we've seen is a drift of the Republican Party in particular into the extreme, led by, but not created by, Donald Trump. And we haven't at all seen a similar drift on the left, and I think falling into describing American politics as polarised falls into the Trump trap of, characterising Joe Biden as a socialist, which he does all the time. You know, I saw him do it at the Libertarian Convention to great cheers. The Libertarians actually loved that bit when he talked about how Joe Biden's a Marxist and a communist. Like, can you imagine if these people encountered an actual Marxist? And so that, I guess, like, that's my huge frustration with this idea of polarization, is that it implies this kind of equal level of extremism, and you know, that the solution is to kind of drag everybody back to this mythical centre, which was kind of part of Joe Biden's pitch, you know, that he was the guy who could reach across the aisle and negotiate with Republicans. And I think we've seen across the course of his presidency the quite dramatic failure of that kind of politics, and I think a failure to recognise the deeper history of the United States, you know, which is a country that has never been united. It has nearly torn itself apart on a number of occasions because it is so deeply divided, and because there are multiple versions of the United States that aren't necessarily reconcilable to each other. So I think be super sceptical anytime you hear anything about how polarised the United States is.
Can we welcome Zoe Daniel? Just up here.
There's some stairs around here.
So, thank you. Your microphone's just on your chair, ready and waiting. We have only just gotten started, so you haven't missed much at all.
Thank you. Sorry I'm late, everyone. I had to be in the chamber, so have just walked out of the Parliament. So apologies.
We're glad to have you. We were just talking about polarisation in the States, and Emma's position that it's over-egged. It's over-egged in discussions. It's over-egged in discussions in the media. Try this. But what I'd like to move to now is Trump's conviction on 34 felony counts. And speaking of history, this is really an extraordinary moment in history, the idea of having a president who potentially is not even in a position to have voted for himself. Emma, would you like to start talking about what it was like for you seeing what happened, the fallout from those convictions?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know about you, Zoe, but I was surprised at how quickly that those convictions came, and that it was guilty on all 34 counts, when this case has been framed from the beginning, I think, as the weakest of the 4 criminal cases against him. I think, like anybody who's watched Trump for a long time, and I know Zoe has too, I'm again pretty sceptical of even polling that suggests a criminal conviction will affect how his base, or how, you know, so-called independent voters think about him, when he's been so successful at laying that narrative about political witch hunts and a weaponised Department of Justice. So, you know, I think it is kind of true when he said, you know, he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and it wouldn't affect his support. But I don't know how you see it.
Yeah, so look, I was in the US when the news broke during the 2016 campaign about Donald and Stormy. I must say that I was not at all surprised at the conviction, and I know it's, you know, it's a lot of charges, but I think anyone who was observing that at the time was just like, well, that's just a fact. We know it happened. The actual details of the payment were uncontested. It was just whether he was trying to exert undue influence in making that payment through his lawyer. And look, I tend to think that people will have already made up their mind about how they feel about that. So I'm not convinced that the convictions will really move people from him. I just have a question about whether it will move people to him. because of exactly what Emma's articulated around the conspiracy theory around the legal system being used against him to prevent him from being president. So I must say I watched the coverage with some surprise, in the sense that I was surprised everyone was so surprised, because I woke up that morning and thought, oh yeah, all right, well that was sort of to be expected. I mean, it's ever fascinating in a kind of train wreck kind of way, isn't it? Yeah.
So if in some senses it was to be expected, do you think that means that it will have less of an impact on American democracy, or it will still be a really extraordinary thing?
Well, I think it's a question of does it actually sort of cement and consolidate his base? And I feel that, you know, in effect, his base is immovable. I mean, throughout the 2016 campaign, he had sort of 30-ish% of the vote, and that remains the case. So those people are there. It's a question of those voters who are maybe not welded on, whether some of them vote for him because of the conspiracy theory piece, or whether some people don't vote because they think that the whole thing is just such a disaster that they won't even get out to vote. And probably everyone in this room understands the significance of that in the US system, but I don't think a lot of Australians understand just how critical the get out the vote piece is in the US. You know, motivating people to care about it enough to go and vote is really critical. And so whether it motivates Democrats to go out and vote to keep him out is a question.
Emma mentioned briefly just before about some potential vice presidential candidates. Do you think that the conviction will have an impact on who he chooses as a vice president?
Good question. Trump is just so Trump. Like, it's just all about him. You know, he probably doesn't even really care that much who his running mate is, you know, because it's just, and he will suck oxygen out of anyone, whoever it is, will sort of be so peripheral to the conversation, other than the could they do it if he couldn't do it sort of question. I don't know, what do you think, Emma?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Like Trump will kind of make the decision based on his gut instinct, and we shouldn't necessarily try and predict that. But there is a real fight going on for it, you know, kind of beneath him, I think. And I was saying before that fight is an ideological one, divided between the kind of, I was saying before, Vivek Ramaswamy disband the FBI, you know, dismantle the Department of Education kind of side, and then the more JD Vance, Mike Pompeo, real deep state kind of guys. And who he chooses will give an indication of who's kind of won that ideological fight. But I think he will choose based on aesthetics and who he thinks is less likely to suck attention away from him. You know, I think he probably wouldn't pick Ramaswamy because he's too thirsty, he's too desperate for attention, whereas someone like JD Vance would be much better, I think, at managing those perceptions and being the kind of more quiet, statesman-like contrast to Trump. I mean, there's certainly an argument that he needs to pick a woman to offset weaknesses, but, you know, he doesn't think he has any weaknesses, so I don't think that's going to motivate him.
Exactly. I mean, JD Vance is a really interesting individual, and I think he's probably in it for the long game. So, you know, one to watch, particularly if he ends up in the vice presidency. You know, I think he's going to be trying to get somewhere. Pompeo, who I've interviewed, and he was, you know, obviously around during the Trump administration, is a real loyalist to Trump. And that'll be meaningful to Trump. That you know, and Pompeo's kind of got that credibility, you know, that sort of international diplomacy, intelligence kind of persona. That might be meaningful to Trump, knowing that he's got that kind of strong man beside him. Yeah.
Independents have obviously been a huge force in Australian politics over the past few years. Do you think that there's space for an increased role for independents in the States and potentially with someone like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in this race, or do you think his influence is going to be minimal?
Look, it's just a very different setting compared to here for obvious reasons. I don't sort of really, and I think most Americans would say it's not really a thing. There's been sort of interest from the American political fraternity, if I could call it that, in what's happened in Australia, but there is just so much money in American politics that to compete as an independent, I think, is really difficult.
Yeah. But I think that's why RFK Jr. is so interesting, because he does have money behind him. You know, he's got some Silicon Valley billionaires in particular, or millionaires who are backing him, particularly women. There are a bunch of women who really like him. There's a reason he picked Nicole Shanahan as his running mate, and I think he is he is a fascinating character. I actually saw him speak at the Libertarian Convention as well, and his politics are quite unexpected. I think there's a tendency here in particular to kind of dismiss him as a cooker because he is one, but he also, you know, he has this kind of real credibility, particularly as an environmental lawyer and somebody who kind of takes on big American corporate interests. And so I think that the kind of Cooker element has an appeal that it wouldn't necessarily in a different space, because he has this history of taking on Big Pharma, which does play, you know, it's not a conspiracy to suggest that Big Pharma is deeply evil and does evil things in the United States. And so I think RFK has this kind of interesting sleeper appeal and is getting big numbers in, you know, of course we should be deeply skeptical of any kind of polling, but he's getting big numbers and he's managing to get on the ballot in states where I think a lot of people predicted that he wouldn't. He's got quite a campaign juggernaut behind him. So I think he really is somebody to watch. And this real uncertainty about who he's taking votes off, is he taking more votes off Trump or Biden, is fascinating.
So what about RFK as the VP?
Again, to go back to Trump, I think he's been too critical of Trump. Trump will never forgive that. You know, when people talk about Nikki Haley as an option because she did take, you know, whatever percentage of the vote of the Republican base off him, she said mean stuff about him and he can't forgive it. He expects loyalty, undying loyalty above all else.
So to turn to pay attention a little bit closer to home, I thought we could talk a bit about AUKUS. And almost from the moment it was announced, AUKUS has been treated as something of a foregone conclusion by some pundits and politicians. I wanted to ask, what conversations aren't we having and what questions should we be asking? Zoe?
Look, I don't think we've had a national conversation about AUKUS. Emma and I spoke together at the Adelaide Writers' Festival and we spoke a bit about this. I have concerns, not to say I'm anti-AUKUS, but because it's bipartisan policy, there's been no real sort of critical analysis of it. And those who have tried to criticise it or even question it have been really shut down in the media. And I don't think that's a good thing. I think that, you know, this is, well, apart from anything else, it's hugely expensive, really significant. There are a lot of question marks over the viability of it in various ways, and the Trump factor is just one. So I think we should be talking about it a lot more. And I think, you know, that from the point of view of accountability, transparency, and the underpinnings of our democracy, that we should be enabling those conversations, and we're really not.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think I'd go further to say, you know, we don't need those submarines and we're not going to get them. And I think we probably need to face that. But I think the fact that we haven't even really got to the point where we can have that conversation is is really quite appalling. And I think it's deeply embarrassing that so much of in the Australian mainstream media at least, and in the kind of punditry around it, the questions about whether there'll be a second Trump administration are fixated on AUKUS. You know, like, if Trump's president again, will he still let us have the submarines? What if he doesn't let us have the submarines? Like, that's not the question. That is not the question that we should be asking ourselves about what a Trump administration would mean for Australia. Like, do we even want those submarines if Trump is president? Do we want to be tied that closely to a United States that's ruled over by somebody like Donald Trump? I mean, I don't think we do, but we're not even we don't even have space to have that conversation in a serious way because of this ongoing bipartisan consensus, you know, assuming that something like AUKUS is a foregone conclusion. But I don't think it is. And I think Trump at least gives us the opportunity to kind of force those questions to the forefront.
And there are some other questions which come to the forefront, whether it's a Trump presidency next or not. For example, Australia's role in the Pacific, both in terms of security and in terms of climate. Would you like to talk about, Zoe, how you see that relationship playing out in the Pacific, whether it's a Trump presidency or not?
Yeah, so I have some concerns, particularly on the conversation around climate and its impact on the Pacific, where we treat this as a sort of humanitarian aid conversation. It's something that I raise often in my conversations with the relevant ministers to say, well, you know, what level of focus are we having on the likely economic impact of climate, the national security implications of climate change in the Pacific, and Southeast Asia. You know, the impact on all of these low-lying communities, the effect on food supplies, for example, the potential fragmentation of sort of social order and governance in those communities. You know, how are we interacting with those issues from the perspective of how that affects Australia going forward? Because often when you ask about, well, what's our level of focus on climate in the Pacific, you'll get a response of, oh yes, well, we're ready to provide support to rebuild and mitigate and help people move and support them through that process. And I think that's actually missing the point, to be honest. And I also worry that our focus on particularly AUKUS and also China is so great that we have this enormous blind spot involving Southeast Asia and the Pacific. You know, as a foreign correspondent, I lived and worked in Southeast Asia for 5 years. These are some of the world's largest cities and some of the world's most low-lying cities. And I lived in Bangkok for 4 years. It's 1 metre above sea level. You know, Jakarta is needing to move. You've got countries like Bangladesh, enormous population, enormous level of need now, and increasing risk from climate change. So that's where I think we should be putting our focus, and I don't think we're putting enough focus on those kinds of issues.
Emma, did you want to respond to that as well?
Yeah, sure. I think, you know, Zoe, I think we're in fierce agreement, but I think that point about the blind spot is such an important one, because this kind of overwhelming idea that we need to be engaging in and supporting great power competition in the Pacific means that genuine action on climate in partnership with the Pacific is at the moment not even close to happening, because what that idea of great power competition means is that both Australia and the United States tend to treat the Pacific as like a kind of giant chessboard where we have to collect all our pieces. And the Pacific peoples in the Pacific are very well aware of that. And I think, you know, Australia's approach to, you know, saying, oh, we're going to support climate mitigation, oh, and don't worry, like, you know, you'll still keep your, we'll still treat you as a state even if you don't have territory any longer, and that's treated like a good and generous thing and not something horrifying, I think is again, you know, not really a conversation that we're having. And Australia in particular, I think, needs to do so much work in partnership with the Pacific and work on being a good faith actor. You know, I think the security agreement that the Australian government made with Tuvalu is such a good example where, you know, it's presented as such a generous thing that we'll take 280 climate refugees a year or whatever the number is. And there's no conversation about whether Australia can actually be treated as a good faith actor in issues of immigration. Like, maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, I see it as a form of carbon offset as well, a really unfortunate form of carbon offset. I mean, you know, how can we be having a good faith relationship with our Pacific neighbours when we're still approving new coal and gas? Those two things are very contradictory, and, you know, saying to the people of Tuvalu, well, you know, once you go underwater, we'll allow you to come here, is a pretty half-assed approach to the issue, really.
And this would be one of the major concerns of a potential second Trump presidency, would be climate policy. What kinds of negotiations, imagining a hypothetical, and the idea of America being one of Australia's closest allies, what kinds of climate negotiations do you think might be possible in those situations?
Very difficult to predict. I mean, again, I covered the Trump administration. I covered Trump pulling out of the Paris Agreement. I covered Trump winding back the Obama era renewable energy initiatives. The question is sort of just how entrenched the IRA will be or is, and sort of what can be removed from it or reversed. Trump, you know, he's just totally transactional. So the question for our government, I think, is how do you work with that? The way that sort of diplomacy and journalism worked, for example, under the previous Trump administration, was it, I think I described it last time Emma and I were on a panel together, was kind of like you threw all the pickup sticks in the air and then you had to figure out where they'd all landed. And, you know, very experienced diplomats and reporters were just running around trying to figure out what was going on, and to sort of find some level of predictability in what he might do. And there simply is none. You know, I would wake up in the morning when I was a correspondent and, you know, the alarm would go off at 5:45 or whatever, and I would just pick up my phone with trepidation. What has he said on Twitter overnight? Because he gets up at about 3:00 in the morning. And there was all that stuff around, you know, the North Koreans and Little Rocket Man and all those sorts of things. And it's just really hard to get a handle on. And I think a lot of it's personality politics. You know, Joe Hockey was the ambassador, transitioned from Kim Beazley as Obama was leaving, and then to Hockey. And Hockey found a way of working with or dealing with Trump. And so finding people who can deal with the Trump administration is really critical.
And that may be part of the reason why Jennifer Robinson on Q&A on Monday was recommending that there be a resolution for the Assange situation before the next election. Would you like to talk a bit about Julian Assange's position, and what you think the chances are of us resolving that before the next election in the States?
So, I mean, as everyone probably knows, the House voted on a motion on Julian some time ago. That was quite significant in that the government supported a motion which came from Andrew Wilkie on the crossbench, in effect saying enough's enough, that Julian should be released. There's a lot of support from across the parliament for that. Various of us do a lot of interaction with Julian's family. I'm really concerned about his mental and physical health. I think that obviously there are things there have been things that have been discussed behind the scenes between the Prime Minister and the US President. In some ways, I sort of feel like we need to get a bit transactional about that too. So, you know, we've got a strong relationship mate. It's time. So short answer, I don't know, but I think that, you know, it seems to make sense that resolving that before the US election would be a good idea.
I might just add that I think momentum is really building for Julian's case. You know, new polling will come out from the Australia Institute this week that shows an overwhelming majority of Australians want the Biden administration to drop the charges and for Julian to come home. There's also a resolution in the Congress, in the House, to free Julian Assange, which has bipartisan support. And, you know, as we've been discussing, there are not many issues that receive bipartisan support in the Congress. But Pramila Jayapal has just signed on from the Progressive Caucus in the last couple of days. And there is, you know, in meetings that we had on the Hill with staffers of representatives, there was a real openness, I think, to Julian's case and a recognition that it has dragged on too long and that it's just a terrible look for the United States to be pursuing an Australian citizen for publishing the truth and suggesting in a court in the UK that he would be subject to the Espionage Act, to the American Espionage Act, but actually wouldn't also enjoy the protections of the First Amendment in the United States. So he would have no rights to free speech in the US. And while Joe Biden is arguing that, you know, democracy is at stake in this election, this is about the heart and soul of America, to be simultaneously prosecuting that argument is a pretty extraordinary thing. So I think that momentum is building, but I think, you know, Zoe is right. Like, we continually, or the Australian government kind of continually underestimates the influence it can have in the United States. There's a great deal of respect and admiration for Australia in Congress, and the Australian government should be using that to demand Julian's freedom, to say, you know, we give you so much, our undying support. We're about to hand over $368 billion for some submarines. This is the least you can do. You know, I think we should be so unapologetic about this and about the consequences of the continued prosecution of Julian for, you know, what we are continually told are our shared democratic values with the United States. I think Julian's case is such an important litmus test for that relationship.
So this is my last question before I open it up to questions from the audience. So you're welcome to come and form an orderly queue by the microphone just here. This is potentially a time of extraordinary change with 2 to 4 billion people voting this year, depending on which calculation you use. We've seen pretty fascinating results in Argentina, in Mexico, and the Indian results are coming in. Not to mention the UK and our own federal elections next year. I was hoping you might be able to reflect a little bit on the prospect of upheaval, not just in potential change of government in the States, but in other places around the world. Emma?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I kind of oscillate wildly between optimism and pessimism, but I think the results out of India have been surprising to many and are really heartening. I think when there was such certainty that Modi would kind of increase his hold, I suppose, on power in India, this result is really heartening. The result in Mexico is also incredibly heartening. You know, we're just talking about climate action. To have a climate scientist elected as the president of Mexico and a woman is an extraordinary thing. And so I think we can take real heart from that. And note that I think that times of upheaval like this, when, you know, Joe Biden is right when he says this is a kind of battle for the soul of American democracy, and the consequences of that are global, but it also comes with extraordinary opportunity for renewal, I think, and a strengthening of democratic institutions, and hopefully that, you know, we can take heart from some of those international results, but also I think be really aware of the dangers, I think, and of not kind of making sure that those guardrails, those democratic guardrails, are in place. Because the danger, particularly in the United States, I think is acute. I was trying to make that optimistic, but I failed. I'm sorry.
Look, I think sort of where we're at is that we have this level of volatility and this lack of predictability that sort of makes it hard to just see what the path forward is. And things like, social media have such a big impact on people's perspectives, and misinformation and disinformation can be hugely influential and can really sort of turn elections. And I think for sort of those of us who have been used to taking a more traditional approach to how things might turn out, that's quite difficult to read. I mean, a lot of people learnt big lessons from the 2016 presidential election in the States, where all of the polling showed that Hillary was going to win. And of course, other stuff was going on under the surface, which wasn't picked up by either the mainstream media or the pollsters. And it was kind of the leading edge of societal change, whereby I think our mainstream media, and to turn to Australia momentarily, our mainstream media is kind of just as wedded to the two-party system as the two major parties are. And I think that applies in kind of a lot of different environments where there's a sense of, oh, well, this is how it's always been, so this is how it'll be. And then something comes out of the box. And one thing that I learnt as a foreign correspondent was that the more weird things get, the more weird things get. Just when you think it can't get any more weird, something even more weird will happen, or more unexpected. And I think that, to a lesser degree, the election of myself and the other independents in 2022 was kind of a surprise to the mainstream media, because if you read all the coverage in the lead up to the election, the papers were like, oh, these guys, they're just a sort of novelty act, and they're not going to win. And then you saw that actually communities said, we want to do something different. So that there's that level of volatility and lack of predictability, which makes it difficult at a time where we are sort of on the precipice of where are we going to go as a world, with a lot of conflict and also undermining of democratic institutions that have kind of internationally held us together to some degree since the Second World War.
Thank you. We have a question, and just a reminder that we're after questions, not comments.
Oh, okay, so the question, which very much leads on from what you were saying, in the paper it says that 1 in 3 Australians are supporting Trump. I'm amazed, but what does that mean for the volatility of Australia?
So I just said that in 2016, the mainstream media and the pollsters all thought Trump was going to lose, and I thought Trump was going to win, because I actually spent a year in inland America talking to people in the so-called flyover states and getting a sense of the dissatisfaction of communities who felt that they were really disconnected from the people who were leading them, and they were looking for a disruptor. And many of them kind of didn't really like that Trump that much. A lot of them had actually voted for Obama because they were looking for a disruptor in Obama, and then they found that disappointing, and then they kind of flipped to Trump because they wanted someone who would shake up the system. And I think that, that cohort exists in Australia as well. And the thing is that the core group that voted for Trump in 2016 and, voted for him again in 2020 are still there. There hasn't been a lot of drift away from Trump. It's really just the electoral college system that got Biden in. So we can't discount the fact that there are people in Australia who are very receptive to that kind of character, that kind of messaging, and that the kind of disruption that kind of personality politician brings.
And I think what we're already seeing as well, probably partly as a reflection of some of those results, is a Liberal Party, and particularly the right wing of the Liberal Party, being emboldened by Trump specifically. Seeing, was it Matt Canavan tweeting about, Trump being kind of under attack and the judicial system, and hoping that never happens in Australia. So there is that element of support, I think, for Trump. But I would almost flip that and say, you know, kind of given the political system in which we operate, like that's probably pretty good news for some independent women candidates. If you have a Liberal Party kind of doubling down on this, you know, kind of narrative about woke politics imported directly from the United States, that's something that independent and particularly women candidates can really use to their advantage, and I would encourage them to do so.
Hello, Matthew Lillywhite. I'm a student here in Canberra at ANU for International Relations. Zoe has spoken before on a couple of different issues. My question is regarding Trump's impact on the broader international relations scope of the Asia-Pacific region. Last time Trump was president, he historically caused China-US relations to crash to historic lows, and as a indirect flow-on effect, Australia's relationship with China also suffered immensely. Both Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping have said they prefer Biden over Trump. What would a Trump presidency mean for US relationships with other great powers in the region, but more broadly, our relationship with those countries as we're trying to navigate those choppy waters, as you described, Zoe?
It's probably more sort of Emma's department, but, you know, obviously, so one of the sort of characteristics of the previous Trump administration was the trade war with China. And obviously all of that interaction with the North Koreans and that sort of very strongman kind of approach. I mean, look, it simply comes back to that, not only the unpredictability of Trump, but his sort of desire to be seen to be bringing great change to the world and having impact, and not always in a good way. And so I think that, look, it'll be very interesting to see how a Labor government deals with Trump, because if you consider the current foreign minister that we have, she has a very sort of measured and sort of reasoned and careful approach to the way that she does foreign policy, and I think that dynamic between Penny and Donald could be quite interesting. Over to you, Emma.
I mean, it is worth thinking about, you know, when in the first Trump administration, foreign diplomats who had same-sex partners were having their partners' visas denied. And so, you know, how you manage those kind of relationships, how you manage being in a room with someone like that is a deeply serious question. And, you know, I think Zoe's right. Like Trump is Trump. He will always be Trump and be unpredictable and transactional, particularly when it comes to his relationships with places like China. But there is underneath that this effort, I think, to cohere policy, and particularly international policy, around an incredibly hawkish view of the world and American power. So I've done some work on something called Project 2025, which is a Heritage Foundation, so an uber conservative think tank's effort to kind of basically have a plan, they call it, ready to hand over to a Trump administration. And some of their foreign policy stuff is pretty terrifying. You know, the hawkishness around China, around increasing the force posture of the United States military by 50,000, increasing the nuclear arsenal, in particular, in their words, to deter both China and Russia at once. So some of this stuff is really scary. And I think there's this perception that Trump doesn't like war, you know, this kind of narrative about how he's the first president since Jimmy Carter to not start any new wars, is something that we should be really sceptical about, because Trump loves violence. He relishes talking about violence in quite graphic detail and talking about weapons. And so if you have those kind of people around him, I think the potential for him to be convinced that violence is the answer is actually quite high. And so navigating that from the perspective of an ally is going to be incredibly, or hopefully we won't get to that point, but hypothetically would be incredibly difficult. And I think, again, you know, we shouldn't underestimate our ability to, as a nation, to stand up for the things that we believe in, and particularly to stand up against that kind of violence. There's this, I think, perception that, we need another Joe Hockey, or we need personalities in there to be able to manage a Trump administration that we need to stay close to regardless, because we need the United States security umbrella. And again, I think that's something that we should be really bringing into question in the light of these possibilities.
One of the issues that's galvanised the right recently is migration, stoked by Fox and News Corp. How do you see that playing out? It seems like it's almost a race to the bottom to see who can adopt the harshest policies. Do you see that being a factor in the election here next year?
I mean, I don't know about here, but I think Zoe's probably in a better position to speak about that. But certainly today, Biden just today has been kind of making or remaking American immigration policy in a very, very harsh, very right-wing way, almost kind of modelled on the worst of Australian immigration policy. And there's been real backlash from the left of the Democratic Party, particularly from the Latina members of the Democratic Party. But it's a kind of representative, I suppose, of that exact, as you described it, the race to the bottom, and this consistent idea, both in Australia and in the United States, that parties of the left must pander to the right in order to win elections. But I don't know if you want to comment on the Australian context in particular.
Yeah, it's sometimes because I've spent so much time as a foreign correspondent, I sort of sometimes forget all the things that have happened. And I was sort of remembering recently the Muslim bans and the Trump's extreme vetting that he introduced quite soon after the 2016 election. And so I remember being at the airport in Chicago where people of particular nationalities were just being blocked from entering the US, and there were, massive protests, and it was just incredibly toxic. And I think that, one thing that we need to be careful of or keep an eye to is that kind of thing sort of enabling policy positions here. It's kind of like the whole fake news catch cry that Trump used to deploy, which was basically any inconvenient truth that criticised him became fake news. And then you started seeing the Australian Prime Minister and a whole bunch of ministers here using that term, and it really eroded the credibility of the media, for example. It was like, oh, well, that was a test case and it kind of worked for Trump, so we'll give that a try. I have a real problem with the kind of dog whistling that comes with, immigration being politicised. And I do think it will be a battleground in the lead up to the election, which I think is really unfortunate. And I just think we need to be really clear about what that's about. Because if you look at the actual numbers around immigration and what's driving the housing crisis and all those sorts of things, the argument that's being made around immigration doesn't really stack up. It's one part of a much bigger picture. And one of the reasons that I got into politics was that the politics of fear, I think, is really offensive, and that's not who we want to be as people or as a nation. So we have to call out that kind of rhetoric.
I think we have time for one last quick question. Thank you.
I'd like to raise a subject that's barely been mentioned this evening, and that's Joe Biden and the Democrats. The situation in Palestine, Israel, has completely, it's like a bomb that's gone off in the middle of in the Democrat Party. And Joe Biden, who's really been has a pretty good sort of instinct for politics, just doesn't seem to know quite what to do. He's damned if he does and damned if he doesn't with Israel. I guess my question is, given the situation with Israel, which I think is going to be make or break, what are his chances of winning with with that going on, because he's losing the Muslim vote all over the place, and if he leans towards the Muslim vote, he's losing the Jewish vote, and Jewish money in particular is hugely important. It's not a conspiracy theory. There are Jewish billionaires who are putting huge amounts of money into the Democrats.
Look, I think it's a really good point. I don't think it's necessarily a straightforward. Actually, I think it's a much bigger question in terms of the vote for Joe Biden than losing Muslim voters in particular. You know, there was a big focus on Michigan in the primaries, where 100,000 voters put in non-committed rather than vote for Joe Biden to express their deep distress at his apparent unwillingness or inability to act. And I think that is an indication of how catastrophic this could be for Biden, because Biden's whole pitch in 2020 was that he was love in answer to hate, that he saw suffering, universal suffering, and understood it and was going to do everything in his power to mitigate it. So he was kind of like the granddad that everybody wanted to have. His refusal, I think, to acknowledge the reality of what Israel is doing in Palestine is catastrophically undermining that political persona, particularly in young voters. And, you know, as Zoe rightly pointed out, getting the vote out is so critical to an election. And there's already an effort underway, I think, to kind of blame those young voters for not turning out, you know, for Joe Biden, rather than an effort to say, well, you know, this is catastrophic for Biden for a reason and that he should be doing more about this. I think his efforts for a ceasefire, particularly this week, and some comments today, are showing that he's, you know, continuing to lose patience with Netanyahu, but he's not willing to go as far as he could. You know, he could end this tomorrow. He could end it in an instant. He could end it with a phone call, and he refuses to do that. And I think that's, you know, it's appalling morally and potentially catastrophic electorally. And his inability to see that, I think, is reflective as well that his politics are the politics of another era. And, you know, he promised from the start to be a generational bridge. Again, that was part of his pitch, and he hasn't done it. He didn't do it.
I almost thought we were going to get through this session without a question about Israel and Gaza. Look, to be fair, I think every world leader is really grappling with this issue, and there's kind of there are right answers, but no matter which one you come up with, you're going to be belted from one side or the other. And in the US, that's particularly the case of obviously a very large Jewish community, and then particular Muslim communities. I do think it's an issue for Biden, and evidently the northern states particularly have already demonstrated that. I think he will be throwing everything into that potential peace deal and hoping like hell that he can actually bring something off. I think we will see increasingly stronger position in regard to the Netanyahu government and some expectation setting of what the US desires from them. Getting back to one of the earlier questions, I think one sort of interesting point might be how many people don't vote on the Democrat side because of that issue, and just how that balances up with the Trump voters and who does or doesn't vote because of the criminal charges factor. And the final thing that I would say is that Trump and Netanyahu are very tight. They have a very close relationship. And for people, Americans who understand that, that might be a reason to vote one way or the other at the election. depending on your leaning.
Thank you. Thank you. Please join me in thanking Emma Shortis and Zoe Daniel. And continue the thanks for Verity Lane Market for hosting us this evening. And to my wonderful colleagues, Hayden, Yasmin, and Andy for everything they've done for tonight. So don't forget to sign up to our list for details for the next Politics at the Pub. There's a sign-up sheet in the back corner. You can subscribe to our podcast wherever you get your good listening. So we have Follow the Money with Ebony Bennett, Dollars and Cents with Greg Jericho, and you'll be very pleased after tonight to learn that we have a new podcast coming with Emma Shortis. So stay tuned for that one. Thank you for coming, and we hope to see you next time.